There is usually nothing extreme about this person when you first meet them. They don't stand out as dramatic or overly emotional, and in many cases they seem calm, responsible, and easy to be around, which is exactly why this pattern often goes unnoticed for a long time. In small, everyday moments, it begins to show itself in ways that are easy to overlook, like saying sorry when someone else bumps into them, or quickly taking the blame when a group conversation becomes uncomfortable. Not because they were actually at fault, but because it feels easier to absorb the tension than to let it grow. If something goes wrong, even slightly, their mind moves fast in one direction, asking questions like, "Did I cause this?" Or, "Was there something I should have done differently?" And this happens almost instantly, before they even have time to step back and look at the situation clearly. Over time, this creates a quiet internal habit where they are constantly scanning their surroundings, not in a paranoid way, but in a careful, alert way, always trying to detect what might go wrong and how they might be connected to it, even when there is no clear link. What makes this pattern harder to recognize is that from the outside, it can look like kindness or maturity, because they are the ones who step in, who take responsibility, who try to keep things stable. But from the inside, it does not feel like a choice. It feels like something they have to do. There is also a subtle confusion that builds over time, because part of them knows that not everything can be their responsibility. Yet another part of them continues to react as if it is. And this gap between what they understand logically and what they feel emotionally starts to create tension. They may even notice moments where they pause and think, "Why am I apologizing right now?" Or, "Why do I feel like this is on me?" But the awareness doesn't stop the behavior. It just makes it more visible, which can be frustrating in a quiet and personal way. This is where the pattern begins to shift from something small and situational into something more defining, because it no longer stays limited to isolated moments. It starts to influence how they respond to people, how they make decisions, and how they see their role in every situation. And once it reaches that point, it no longer feels like they are just being helpful or considerate. It starts to feel like they are responsible for holding things together, even when no one has asked them to, and even when it comes at a cost to themselves. And this is where the real question begins, because this pattern doesn't stay contained in small interactions. It expands into every part of their life in ways that are much harder to ignore. In a family setting, this pattern often turns the person into the one who quietly manages emotional balance. Not because anyone officially gave them that role, but because they step into it again and again until it becomes expected. And over time, they become the one who notices tension first, the one who tries to calm arguments, and the one who feels responsible for how everyone else is feeling, even when those emotions have nothing to do with them. They may find themselves mediating between family members, choosing their words carefully to avoid triggering conflict, and taking on the emotional weight of situations that were never theirs to carry. And while others move on after disagreements, they continue replaying the situation in their mind, wondering if they could have handled it better or prevented it entirely. At work, the same pattern shows up in a different form, where responsibility becomes tied to performance and reliability, and they begin to overcompensate not only for their own mistakes, but also for the mistakes of others, stepping in to fix problems before anyone asks, and often taking blame to keep things moving smoothly, even when it costs them recognition or fairness. They become the person others depend on because they rarely say no. And while this may look like strength from the outside, it creates an internal pressure that keeps building. Because every new responsibility reinforces the idea that it is their job to hold everything together, and stepping back starts to feel risky instead of reasonable. In relationships, this pattern becomes even more personal because it directly affects how they connect with others, and they may prioritize their partner's needs so consistently that their own needs begin to fade into the background, not because they don't exist, but because expressing them feels like it might create imbalance or conflict. They may apologize during disagreements just to restore calm, even when they are not at fault, and they often take on the emotional responsibility for how the relationship feels overall, believing on some level that if something goes wrong, it must be because they didn't do enough to prevent it. Over time, this creates a dynamic where they are always adjusting, always giving, and rarely asking for the same in return. And while this can keep the relationship stable on the surface, it slowly builds an imbalance that is difficult to recognize until it becomes too heavy to ignore. As this pattern continues across different areas of life, the effects begin to accumulate in ways that are not immediately visible, starting with exhaustion that doesn't come from physical effort alone, but from constantly monitoring, adjusting, and taking on responsibility that extends beyond what is actually theirs. There is also a form of quiet resentment that can develop, not directed at any specific person, but at the situation itself, because part of them begins to feel that they are carrying more than others without acknowledgement. Yet they struggle to express that feeling, because doing so would mean stepping out of the role they have built over time. The most subtle but significant effect is a shift in identity, where they begin to define themselves through this pattern, not in obvious terms, but through questions that slowly change over time, like, am I the one who keeps things stable, or what happens if I stop doing this? And these questions are not easy to answer because the pattern has become deeply connected to how they see their place in the world. At this stage, it is no longer just about behavior. It becomes a structure that shapes their decisions, their reactions, and their expectations in every situation. And even when they recognize that something feels off, the pattern continues because it has been reinforced across so many different contexts. And this is where the tension begins to build more clearly, because the more they take on, the more it starts to conflict with something else inside them, something that is beginning to question whether this level of responsibility is sustainable or even necessary. At some point, a shift begins to happen inside them, not suddenly, but gradually, as the weight of constant responsibility starts to become harder to ignore, and they begin to notice a quiet desire for relief, a simple wish to not feel like everything depends on them all the time. They may start asking themselves questions they didn't ask before, like, what would it feel like to not step in? Or, what happens if I just let things be? And these questions are not dramatic, they are practical, but they carry a deeper tension because they challenge a pattern that has been in place for a long time. At the same time, even as this desire for relief becomes clearer, something else remains just as strong, which is the inability to actually stop. Because the moment a situation begins to shift or tension appears, the same automatic response takes over, and they find themselves stepping back into the role without thinking. This creates a loop that is difficult to break, where one part of them wants to release the responsibility, but another part reacts as if letting go would lead to something going wrong, even if they cannot clearly explain what that something is. Underneath this loop, there is often a belief that is not always spoken out loud, but still shapes their reactions, and it can sound like this: if I don't hold everything together, something will fall apart. And even if they recognize that this is not always true, the feeling behind it remains strong enough to guide their behavior. There is also a layer of fear that is not obvious on the surface, because it doesn't always appear as anxiety or panic, but more as a steady sense of caution, like they are always trying to prevent a problem before it happens, even when there is no clear sign that anything is about to go wrong. As this continues, the cycle becomes more defined, where responsibility leads to pressure, pressure leads to exhaustion, and exhaustion does not stop the pattern. It simply makes it harder to question, because they are too used to functioning this way to imagine something different. This is the point where it becomes clear that this is no longer just a habit or a personality trait. It is a system that runs automatically, and even when they see it happening, even when they understand it logically, that awareness does not immediately give them the ability to change it. And this creates the core contradiction, because they are both aware and stuck at the same time, wanting something to shift, but continuing to respond in the same way. And this raises a deeper question that cannot be answered just by looking at the surface of their current life. So the question becomes more direct and more difficult to ignore, because if this pattern feels so strong and so consistent, then where did it actually come from? At this point, instead of trying to force an answer from what is visible in the present, it can be useful to look at this pattern from a different angle, not as something random or purely situational, but as something that may have a deeper origin. And this is where the perspective of Edgar Cayce offers a way to reinterpret what we are seeing without turning it into a belief system. In many of his readings, Cayce described patterns of behavior that did not begin in the current lifetime, but instead carried over from previous experiences where the emotional or practical stakes were much higher. And in those situations, a person's decisions could directly affect the well-being, safety, or outcome of others in very real and immediate ways. If we apply that idea here, one possible interpretation is that this sense of responsibility did not come from nowhere, but from a time when being responsible was not optional, when the consequences of action or inaction were significant, and where holding things together was not just helpful, it was necessary. In that kind of context, responsibility becomes more than a role. It becomes a form of survival, because if something goes wrong, the impact is not abstract or delayed. It is immediate and real. And over time, that level of responsibility can shape how a person responds to situations at a very deep level. What happens then is not that the person consciously remembers those experiences, but that the pattern of response remains. And when similar emotional signals appear in the present, even in much smaller or safer situations, the same internal reaction is activated as if the stakes are still the same. From this perspective, the behavior we see now is not random or excessive without reason. It can be understood as an overcorrection, where the system that once protected against real consequences continues to operate even when those original conditions are no longer present. This also helps explain why the pattern feels so difficult to stop, because it is not just a surface habit that can be changed with simple awareness. It is connected to a deeper sense of what is safe and what is risky, even if that sense does not match the current reality. It is important to keep the tone clear here, because this is not about asking someone to believe in past lives as a fixed truth. It is about using this framework as a way to make sense of a pattern that otherwise feels confusing or disproportionate to the situations in which it appears. When you look at it this way, the constant feeling of responsibility begins to shift in meaning. Because instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" the question becomes, "What kind of situation would make this response necessary?" And that change in perspective can open up a different way of understanding the pattern. It also brings attention to the idea that the intensity of the response may not match the current situation, not because the person is overreacting in a simple sense, but because the response is calibrated to something that is no longer present, something that belonged to a different context, where the cost of getting it wrong was much higher. Seen this way, the pattern starts to look less like a flaw and more like a system that has not updated itself, continuing to operate based on conditions that no longer exist, but still feel real at an emotional level. And this is why logic alone often fails to change it. And once you begin to consider that possibility, it naturally leads to a broader question. Because if this pattern can be understood through this lens, then how many other people are experiencing the same thing in different forms? And how does this pattern show up across different lives and situations beyond just one case? When you step back and look beyond a single person, this pattern begins to appear in many different forms, and while the details may change from one life to another, the core structure remains the same, which is a strong and persistent sense of responsibility that extends beyond what the current situation actually requires. Some people experience this pattern mainly on an emotional level, where they feel responsible for how others feel, constantly adjusting their tone, their words, and their reactions to prevent discomfort or conflict. And they may not even realize how much energy this takes, because it has become part of how they naturally interact with others. Others experience it in a more practical or situational way, where they take on tasks, solve problems, and manage outcomes that go beyond their role, stepping in before being asked and often carrying more than what is expected, because it feels safer to handle things themselves than to risk something going wrong. There are also cases where the pattern shows up as a strong moral responsibility, where the person feels accountable not just for actions, but for outcomes, fairness, and the well-being of others. And this can create a constant pressure to do the right thing in every situation, even when the situation itself is unclear or outside their control. Despite these variations, the internal chain often follows a similar structure, where an initial sense of guilt, whether clear or subtle, leads to an increased sense of responsibility. And over time, that responsibility becomes part of identity, so that the person no longer asks, "Should I take this on?" but instead assumes that they should. This is where the pattern becomes more stable and more difficult to question, because it is no longer tied to specific situations. It becomes a default way of responding. And even when circumstances change, the internal response remains consistent, as if it is operating on its own logic. When you compare this to other known patterns, there are clear overlaps, such as what is often described as over-responsibility, where individuals take on more than is realistically theirs, or hyper-awareness, where a person constantly monitors their environment to anticipate and prevent problems. And while these terms describe the behavior, they do not always explain why the pattern feels so deeply rooted. The important point here is that this pattern is not random, and it is not simply a collection of habits. It has a structure, and that structure repeats across different people and different situations, even when their backgrounds or life circumstances are very different. You can see this in how quickly the pattern activates, often before conscious thought has time to intervene, and in how consistent it remains over time, even when the person becomes aware of it and tries to change it, which suggests that it is supported by something deeper than surface-level behavior. At the same time, it is also important to recognize that there is more than one way to interpret this pattern, because while one perspective may point to past experiences beyond the current lifetime, another perspective may focus entirely on what happened within this life, and both approaches can describe similar behaviors from different angles. What matters is not choosing one explanation over another too quickly, but recognizing that the pattern itself is real and consistent, and that it follows a logic that can be observed, whether you interpret its origin as psychological, experiential, or something that extends beyond the present context. And once you begin to see how widespread and structured this pattern is, it naturally leads to the next step, which is to look at how modern psychology understands this same behavior and what it reveals about the way people learn, adapt, and carry responsibility over time. When this pattern is viewed through a psychological lens, it begins to look less like something mysterious and more like something learned over time, shaped by repeated experiences where taking responsibility helped create stability or reduce conflict. And because those moments mattered, the behavior became reinforced. In many cases, this kind of response can develop in environments where a person had to become aware of others very early, noticing changes in tone, mood, or tension, and adjusting their behavior to keep things balanced. Not because they were told to do so directly, but because they learned that this was the safest way to navigate their surroundings. This can lead to a form of hyper-awareness, where the person is constantly monitoring what is happening around them, trying to predict how situations might unfold and what they can do to prevent negative outcomes. And over time, this creates a strong connection between awareness and responsibility. There is also a concept often described as over-responsibility, where individuals begin to take ownership of things that are not actually within their control. And while this may start as a practical adaptation to specific situations, it can continue long after those situations have changed, because the pattern itself has become automatic. What makes this pattern persist is that it often works in the short term, because stepping in, fixing problems, or absorbing tension can lead to immediate results, such as avoiding conflict or keeping situations stable. And those results reinforce the behavior even if it creates long-term strain. At the same time, this does not mean that the psychological explanation cancels out other perspectives, because what we are looking at is the same pattern appearing through different lenses, one focusing on learned behavior within this life, and another suggesting that the roots may extend beyond it. And both approaches attempt to describe why the response feels so consistent and difficult to change. The key point is that regardless of where the pattern started, the experience of it is real, and it affects how a person thinks, reacts, and relates to others on a daily basis, shaping decisions in ways that may not always be visible from the outside. And when you bring these perspectives together, instead of choosing one and rejecting the other, you begin to see a more complete picture, where the pattern is both learned and carried, both reinforced and repeated. And this allows you to move closer to understanding what it actually means at its core. So the focus shifts again, not just to where the pattern came from, but to what it is doing now, and what it reveals about how responsibility can continue even when the original reason for it is no longer present. At the center of this pattern, there is a simple but important realization that is easy to overlook because the behavior feels so natural, and that is this: responsibility can continue even when the original cause is no longer present. And when that happens, the person is no longer responding to what is in front of them, but to something that has already passed. What this means in practical terms is that the intensity of their response is not always connected to the current situation, because the system they are using to interpret that situation was shaped under different conditions. And even though those conditions have changed, the response has not fully adjusted. Over time, this creates a gap between reality and reaction, where the person continues to act as if the consequences are still active, still immediate, and still dependent on them, even when that is no longer true. And this gap is often where the exhaustion and confusion begin to build. As this continues, responsibility slowly shifts from something they do into something they believe they are. And this is where identity becomes involved. Because if they see themselves as the one who holds things together, then stepping back does not just feel like a change in behavior, it feels like a loss of role. This also explains why awareness alone is often not enough to change the pattern. Because even if they understand logically that not everything depends on them, the deeper system still reacts as if it does. And that reaction continues until something allows it to be re-examined at a deeper level. So the core insight is not just that they take on too much responsibility, but that they are operating from a pattern that has outlived its original purpose. And until that is recognized clearly, the pattern will continue to repeat in situations where it is no longer needed. So if you recognize yourself in this pattern, or even just parts of it, the question is not simply whether you take on too much responsibility, but something more specific and more personal, because the pattern itself points to something that has not been fully understood yet. If you feel responsible for everything, even when it does not make logical sense, then what are you still trying to prevent from happening again? And more importantly, what does it feel like might happen if you stop holding everything together, even for a moment. This is not a question that needs an immediate answer, and it is not something you have to resolve all at once. But it is a direction to look in, because understanding the pattern starts with seeing what it is connected to, not just what it looks like on the surface. And once you begin to look at it this way, the pattern may start to shift slightly, not because you force it to change, but because you are no longer responding to it automatically. You are starting to see it as something that can be observed and understood over time. If this made you think about something in your own life, or if you've noticed moments where you felt responsible in ways you couldn't explain, share that in the comments. Because those patterns are often clearer when they are spoken out loud and reflected on. And if there is a part of this that still doesn't make sense to you, or a specific experience you want to understand better, let me know as well, because those questions often lead to the next story we explore here on Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you found this useful, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.